Hey guys, this is Phil Swift here from Terra School of Swords, and we have a special video series for you. I'm working on Destreza Saber at the moment, and this series is going to document my journey into learning something completely new. I actually have zero saber experience myself, so this is a total entire different beast that I'm getting into. And what I'm gonna do is we're gonna document all the exercises and drills that I developed in order to teach myself Destreza Saber, and you as the viewer can follow along, learn all this stuff with me, work on it with me. I will also need your help with suggestions, or if you have any questions, feel free to leave it in the comment. I'm going to start a Facebook group called Destreza Saber, and I'm hoping people join that Facebook group, and we can work together and figure this all out. And I would definitely recommend this book if you want to follow along and do this with me. Now this is probably my third time reading through this, so I also recommend that you should have this all read at least once before you embark on this journey with me. So once again, link is provided down below. So first off, let's talk about the original author of this treatise or manual, Don Jaime Marcielo y Casademunt. Sorry, that last part sounded pretty French, but I can't do the Spanish pronunciation of that last word. But Don Jaime or Don Jaime, little is really known about him. It doesn't say much about his past in the manual. We know that in the title of the book, it says Professor of Fencing at the Infantry College of Toledo. So he was a professor at some point teaching cadets how to fence, the art of fencing, saber. We don't know if he's taught other weapons as well. We just know that he mentions saber, and I believe he talks a little bit about bayonets as well. But anyway, that's about all we know about him. Now, if you want to know more about the weapon that was used during this time, which the book was published, which is 1862. If you want to know more about the weapons used, the sabers used during this time, I would recommend checking out Esgrima Xativa's video. And that link will be also be posted below the video as well. In short, the saber that they were using were a little bit straighter than your cavalry curved saber. As you can see here, it was still curvy, but not as curvy as you can see. It was very light, so it's not as heavy as your cavalry saber as it is an infantry saber. Now, Xativa, Esgrima Xativa's channel, he actually owns a couple of antiques, so he'll give you the weight and all the measurements as well. It seemed pretty back weighted, as the point of balance was closer to the hilt. So it was fairly light. We're talking about 600 to 700 grams, which is about just over a pound to a pound and a half. So these were fairly light swords, and it gets even lighter apparently as the years go on. But for now, I purchased myself a Castile economic saber, which I'll do a review at some point soon. Now these bad boys are fairly inexpensive compared to other sabers. They're cast steel, so you know they'll last you a fairly long time. Very well made, very good quality. These are about 700 grams, so it's right on the weight that you're looking for. Now these are more curved than the ones that are shown in the book. I know it's hard to see, but they are more curved. It's not as straight, but the weight is close. The balance is sort of close. In the size, I think it's a good size. So now I'm not a saber expert or anything like that. The hilt might be different, but honestly, like it's good enough for a trainer that isn't gonna break my bank. So I would recommend using that sword for now until I find a sword that fits the purpose, better and is more affordable. The one thing about the Spanish saber, now I don't know if this is the same with other sabers as well, but one thing that they did mention in the book is that the Spanish saber also has a back edge. That's about, I don't know exactly how far the back edge goes, but it does have a back edge. So there are some false edge cuts that are mentioned in the book. I won't go through every chapter in the book, but I will go through some that I think is important or need clarification. I won't go exactly in the order of the book. I'm gonna kind of throw in or mix up the orders slightly because it just makes a little bit more sense to me that way. For instance, we'll talk about the 3 circles, which are essentially the cuts that the arm can make. But if you don't know how to stand, if you don't know how to hold the sword, then how are you gonna go do that? So I've rearranged some of the orders of things, but like I said, I just want you to make sure you've read the book at least once, and then this will sort of make sense, fill in the holes for you and whatnot. Now, Jaime did not mention or give us any information on how to grip the saber, besides maybe like very little. I think he spoke about it maybe once, but didn't give us a lot of information. Essentially, if you look at all of the illustrations, you will see what is a thumb grip, or I call it the handshake grip, with the thumb being on top where the back is. Thumb is rested on the back of the saber, so you can assume that he's using a handshake or thumb grip, and you can kind of see that his hand is near the bottom mostly. There's a little bit of space for his thumb and index finger near the top of the grip there. Now, Raworth mentions a hammer or handshake grip. We'll be using the handshake grip, which I feel like it's meant for lighter weapons. You have your hammer grip, and then you have your handshake grip. Notice the angle. Hammer grip. My tip and point is, if my opponent is over there, my tip and point is nowhere near being able to hit my opponent. However, in the handshake grip, I can pretty much hit my opponent. So those are some of the advantages with the handshake grip versus the hammer grip. Just in very short. But like I said, it's also, I prefer the handshake grip. It feels better for tip control when you're disengaging or trying to thrust or trying to position your blade in certain angles that are more advantageous to you. This will strengthen the hand and forearm muscles. Now, this is just something I came up with because I feel like in the handshake grip, because I'm not used to Sabre, it still feels a little bit heavy for my fingers and my hand. Jaime mentions many different cuts, and we'll go through that in a second. But one of the cuts he mentioned is called a chop, which is what he calls composed of two movements, which is violent, which is a rising motion or movement, and then natural, which is a downward movement. So violent, natural. So up, up, down, right? So these are two movements. Now, if you read the book, you'll know what I'm talking about. I'm not going to go into details with that. I'm assuming you read the book. Now, the chop could be done with with the elbow. You can just go up and down, or with the whole arm, and we'll get into the 3 circles in a bit. But for this exercise, mainly, I just want people to use their wrist, so that this works out your hand muscles and your forearm muscles, which is much needed. For Sabre, loosen the last 3 digits, squeeze the thumb and the index, bring that sword upwards. From here, you're going to squeeze the last 3 fingers. So notice that my sword was more forward, tip rolled towards me backwards with the loose grip, and then with the tightening of the 3 fingers, that points your sword more forward. So that's a chop being done with just your wrist. And what we're going to do is we're going to continue doing that. And you'll notice that your forearm, your fingers, everything will start feeling tight. And you'll know that you'll be working out your forearms and fingers that way. Now, make sure you switch hands as well. So once the right gets tired, you switch over to the left, and you can do this while you're watching TV. We're going to take this exercise to another level. What we're going to do is picture your opponent's sword somewhere. So this is my hand. I'm picturing that my opponent's sword is right here. Now, we got to understand that you got to understand your insides and outsides before you can do this exercise. So if you look at me, and I will present my blade right here, anything on this side is the outside of the sword. Anything on this side is the inside of the sword. So my head, my left shoulder is within my inside. This shoulder right here, my right shoulder, is on my outside. So if you imagine your opponent, mirror image of yourself, and their sword is right here, then technically this is their inside, and this is their outside. So just for example, we're going to start from our outside, and we're going to place our sword right there. If we're doing our stage 1 or normal chop, we'd just be chopping towards the same side. But this is the more complicated version. So what we're going to do here is we're actually going to start on the outside, but when we bring the tip back by loosening the bottom 3 fingers, we're going to bring our tip back, and then what we're going to do is we're going to change our line from the outside to the inside, and then we're going to squeeze our bottom fingers to complete the chop. Okay? So again, from the inside, we're going to loosen up our 3 fingers to bring the saber back, to disengage away from our opponent's blade, and then we're going to squeeze the 3 fingers to bring the saber forward. But instead of cutting on the inside line, you're going to cut on the outside line. So then it's going to look like this. Okay? Try that. It's basically a chop with a disengaging over the top of your opponent's blade and chopping on the other side. And this is just with the wrist. So try not to use your elbow, your shoulder. We're just working on the wrist, and we're working and we're trying it out side to side. Now it is very important to not break your wrist. Notice that my wrist is straight right now in a handshake grip. This is when your wrist breaks. So notice that my wrist and forearm is straight, and as soon as I do something like this, it's not straight anymore. That's breaking the wrist. You're breaking your structure of your wrist. And when you actually cut with sharps, you'll notice that it does make a significant difference. But not only that, but you're actually straining your wrist when you do that. So that may lead to some damages in the long term. Try to make sure that when you do your chops, you always end up with a straight wrist. So your ending point should be where your wrist is straight and you're not breaking your wrist. Okay. So next up, let's talk about the 4 stances that Jaime gives you. So I've developed a drill that puts them essentially all together, and we're gonna do them forward, and then we're gonna do them reverse, so that you understand the transitions behind them, but at the same time, they're all in a sequence that you can practice it moving forward and backwards. So the first stance that he talks about is your beginning stance, which is the right angle stance. You're forming a right angle with your heels, positioning of your toes and your heels and whatnot. So you're forming what is called an L stance. Now the thing about the L stance is that I prefer you leaving some space for your heel to pass through. As you later find out in Sabre, that there is slipping, which is where you, or cross-stepping, which is where you place your front foot behind your back foot, or your back foot in front of your front foot. And if your heels are in the way of each other, then your front feet would have to kind of move around the back foot, or your back foot has to move around the front foot. So I prefer to have both my heels sort of not in each other's way, so that if you want to do a slip with the front foot, you can move without your heel being in your way. And if you want to do a crossing step with the back foot, you can do that easily. So that's how I like to do it. That's how I prefer to do it. Now Jaime doesn't tell you at all in the book, besides this one drawing that you can see that he is teeing up. So now, like I said, if you want to follow the book, feel free to do it his way. I just prefer this way, and I'm giving you my reasons for it. So you start off in the first stance, which is sort of your beginning position. You'll go into the second stance, which is about 1.5 feet apart from each foot. So you want to sort of measure out 1.5 feet apart, and he says that's the max you can go depending on height. So he doesn't want you to go any further than that. So anywhere that's comfortable for you, from I guess 1 foot to 1.5. Legs are in this position, you're ready to pass into any other position. So this will be the stance where you will use for your on guard position. Now the third position is the slip or the cross step. If you're doing it forwards, slip if you're doing it backwards. For the sake of going forward, literally, we're gonna do the cross step instead of the slip. So you're gonna take your back leg and you're gonna bring it right in front of your front leg. Now, notice that in the first stance I mentioned, you can see in the video that I am showing you that I'm turning my hips to be more squared towards my opponent. So I'm turning my hips clockwise. Now make sure that you have your hips turned like that for this slip or cross step, because it will help you stay balanced when you're cross stepping or slipping if your hips are more squared towards your opponent. He prefers a pretty deep, I guess, cross step or slip, which is quite interesting to see. If you have a look at the book here, you'll notice that he's got quite some distance between his feet there. I think that's a bit too far from the looks of that illustration, but it's about 1 foot apart. So the lunge is, he explains it as 1.5 foot extension. So your total distance in between each foot should only be a 3 foot spread. So it's not a really deep lunge. It's it's a pretty decent lunge. It's more than a demi lunge, but it is not like a deep French lunge, for example. Now the 5th position is shifting the weight, or what he calls equilibrium. I just call it shifting the weight because that's essentially what you're doing. I see that as a way to recover. So if you are a rapier fencer, you'll notice that you'll shift weights or throw your head back when you're trying to recover from a lunge, right? So throwing your head back will automatically shift your weight as you whip your head back. You can see here that what I'm doing is I am just straightening out my front leg because it was bent from the lunge, and I am bending my back leg. So you're shifting weights to either recover or to maybe move back. Basically, there's many reasons for you to shift weights like this, but for this exercise, I'm doing it as a recovery from the lunge, to teach you how to recover from the lunge. Now, after you shift weights to your back foot, from here, you're gonna just do everything backwards. So you lunge, you recover from your lunge, and now you're going to go into a slip, which is placing your front foot behind your back foot as another way to gain distance. Usually slips are used to sort of dodge attacks, just to slip out of the measure of the attack and then come forward with a riposte, or basically a counter. So think of it that way. You're trying to slip backwards, and careful, make sure you bend your knees. You don't want to see your head bopping up and down, so you want to make that transition kind of smooth. So after you slip, what you're going to do from the slip is you're going to recover from the slip back into your stance, which is your position 2, and then when you're back in your stance, to finish the exercise, you're gonna go right back to your beginning L stance or right angle stance, which is your first position, and then you're gonna rinse, repeat that until you have it down. If you want to break it up, like for instance, just go from slip to lunge or stance to lunge, and then shifting your weight to recover from the lunge, then going back into the slip or going back to the stance. Feel free to do that. I definitely encourage you to do that, breaking everything up. This is just how it was structured in the book, and I'm trying to stay true to what the exercises that he gives us from the book. I've just remixed it slightly by doing it forward and backwards. So what Jaime says about the on guard position is that you want your left hand right on your hip, you want your thumb to be on your back, and your fingers to be on your belly side. Okay. Essentially, you want your hilt above the hips, elbow at the same height. So that means you're gonna have your elbow kind of straight with your wrist. And you want, he says, about 2 inches away from the body. So my fist is relatively 2 inches. It's probably 2.5 or 3, but that's fine. So you want to put about a fist length in between your elbow and your rib, or and you want to have your forearm on the same plane as the floor. So you want to have it parallel to the floor. Now you want he says the blade edge to be pointed at your opponent. Since we're doing this solo, you can try the on guard position on the outside or inside. Now the weird thing, he doesn't mention. Well, you can see all of his guards. That his blade positioning is actually further away from the body. So his inside guard will be something like this, and then his outside guard will be something like this. Whereas Roworth will say, you want your tip from the outside guard, you want your tip pointed at the opposite eye. So it will end up like this instead of this. So now the problem about what Jaime says is that it kind of contradicts itself. So if I'm on the outside like this and my opponent is supposed to be on the outside like this, how is that possible, right? So if we were engaging or crossing our swords from the outside, it would be very weird for us to end up in this position. We'll probably end up in something like this. So I'm going to go with what Roworth said. If we're engaging on guard on the inside or outside, it'll be like this. Maybe as a but as an actual parry, if I was engaged on the inside instead of like this, pointing at my opposite eye or eyebrow. When my opponent goes to strike me on my outside, I will parry the way Jaime told us, which is to make a sort of bigger parry and have our sword sort of angled more away from our body versus something like this. So lastly, last section of this video I like to cover is the 3 circles of the arm. Now, this is in chapter 3, where Jaime talks about the arm of man, or the arm of people, essentially. So he mentions 3 circles. The first circle is the biggest circle, second gets smaller, third is the smallest. So what he's talking about is the circles of which the arm makes when we do cuts. It's almost like Silver's principles, where what he's saying is the biggest circle is when you use your whole arm, which is your shoulder, your elbow, your wrist, to do a cut. So you're using your whole arm, shoulder, everything to do a cut. And one of the cuts that you would do with that kind of big motion would be the tajo and the Rivas, which is forehand cut or backhand cut. Now, if you take a look at the illustration here, you'll see circle A, B, and C. A is your biggest circle, B gets smaller, C is the smallest. So the big circle, he's talking about using your shoulder, your elbow, your wrist to form big cuts. So tajos, revés, those are all big cuts. So drills for the first circle, which is the biggest circle. We're going to start off with doing Tahoe and Rivas. So in order to do the Tahoe, essentially what you want to do is from your on guard position, you're going to do what is called, I believe it is the ninth, or sorry, the eighth parry. So it's a higher parry that kind of looks like this. Essentially, you want it above your head mainly, and you want the sword to the tip to be about 2 feet away from your body. Now he says 2 feet away. I don't know if it's this way or that way. I assume it's this way, and on the same the tip pretty much is on the same plane as your nipples or your chest. So that's where you sort of want it to be. So it's more like a upper, like a hanging parry essentially. So you're gonna go into your eighth parry, from your on guard position to eighth parry, and then from the eighth parry you're going to perform the Tahoe, which is a descending cut from right to left side. And then as soon as you finish from that position, you go back to like an inside guard. And then from there, you'll move on to the ninth parry, which is so it's sort of like looking at your fingernails. So you bring your fingernails up to look at them, but you want to make sure your hilt is above your head. And they say the elbow and the arm is probably on the same plane as your shoulder. So elbow, shoulder, make a window like this, and protect your head. Hilt, sword above your head, like so, and point about 2 feet away from your body. And from there, you're going to perform your revés, which is a cut from the left to the right. So Tahoe, right to left, revés, left to right. And you're gonna finish. When you finish your revés, you want to go back into a guard, so an outside guard or inside guard. He doesn't really mention that, but it's just from Rollworth, and it's a good habit to get into. What the eighth and ninth parry looks like, that's what they look like from the book. So your Tahoe would be this one here, which is look at your watch. So this one here, look at your watch, that's your eighth parry. So from I say from your outside guard, you're gonna go up into an eighth parry, and then you're gonna perform a Tahoe cut from the right to the left. For the revés, you're gonna start from your inside guard, and then you're gonna go into the ninth parry, which is sort of looking at your nails or checking out your nails. And then you're gonna go into the revés, which is a descending cut from the left to the right. He mentions the second circle formed by movements only of the elbow. So those would be your quicker cuts, as it is slower to move, your whole arm versus just moving your elbow. The elbow, this part is a lot faster than moving your whole arm. So for the movements formed with the elbow, I assume would be your medio Tahoe or medio revés. Now that's your, I guess, semicircle cuts, or what I call them half cuts. John Jaleski calls them semicircles or semi-cuts, semi-forehand or semi-backhand cut. Anyway, so their form, the reason why they are, a semi-cut or a half cut is because instead of forming a full circle, you are just doing a half circle. So you are for instance, if you're engaged on the the outside, you're going to disengage or make a semicircle and cut them towards the inside, or from inside to outside, vice versa. So you're making these sort of half circle movements with just your elbow, right? So those are your medio tajos and medio revés. The third circle, which is just your wrist, we've been working on this actually with the chops. The third circle are movements only formed by the wrist. So this is the fastest movement of the three circles. So this circle is the fastest because the wrist is faster than the elbow, which is faster than the shoulder, right? So all movements formed by the wrist is the quickest. Movements that are formed by the wrist would be your I guess, in a sense, your stop cuts, right? Which we'll mention in the future. But for now, let's just say your cuchaladas, which are slicing motions, are done with the wrist. So just side to side slicing. You can actually see it in the illustration. You'll see a sort of a small diameter within that smaller circle, right there. That is the slicing motion that happens in that smaller circle. So they're not big slices, they're just with the wrist slicing, right? You can also do medio tajo y medio revés, or chops, with the wrist. So sort of, instead of your chops is more like, I guess, like a more boxy, like a V almost. If you want to do the medio revés or medio tajo, it will essentially just be a smoother motion. So you're trying to draw a half circle instead of doing what we were doing before, which is sort of like this V motion, okay? We're just gonna smoothen that out and kind of cut around like that. So that would be your three circles of the arm. So the three ways, I guess, of cutting, of using the arms to perform techniques that will wound the opponent. So now he doesn't specify that you should use, like for instance, all of your arm when you're doing tajos or revés. I mean, granted, it would make sense to, but he's not very specific on you should only do this with that. Like for instance, Roworth is very specific. He says he wants you to do all of the cuts with the wrist because that's the fastest, right? And it makes sense, but Jaime doesn't tell you that specifically. He wants you to use them because he sees advantages and disadvantages in all three circles, and he wants you to use it strategically to your own advantage. Like for instance, the third circle, which is formed by the wrist, is the fastest circle, and we all can agree on that. Now he says, surprisingly, it all goes around in a circle. So the third circle can be defeated by the first circle, which is the slowest circle. Which you're like, that doesn't make sense because the third circle is the fastest circle. But he's saying the first circle could defeat the third circle because if you know that cut is coming, you in the first circle, as you form your cut, you're actually in the first movement you're making a parry. So you're setting aside that threat, and then when you finish your tajo or revés, you're gonna parry that fast cut, and then you're gonna come and riposte with your own, or counter with your own. So in that big motion, you could counter a motion from the third circle, and vice versa. So for instance, the second circle, when you're moving the elbow to execute your cuts, the moment you lift up, the moment you lift your sword up with a violent movement, you're exposing your forearm. So in that instant that you're preparing your cut for instance, your medio tajo or medio revés, you open up your forearm, and if you're quick with the third circle, you can literally hit your opponent on the forearm the moment they expose that. So what he's trying to say is you want to understand all the circles, you want to understand the movements and how they differentiate from each other, one being faster, the other being slower. But at the same time, you can also use slower motions to defeat faster motions. Practice all three circles, techniques from the three circles, and we're going to go more into that in a bit. But for now, we've mentioned I want to say 4 types of cuts. We've mentioned the bigger cuts, which is your tajo, your revés, which is done on the first circle, the big circle, and then you have your second circle, which is your medio tajo, medio revés. So you're going to practice your medio tajos, your medio revés, and then you're going to practice just the third circle, which is movements from the wrist, which is your slices, your chops, or your medio tajo, medio revés. And that should be enough for this episode. The next episode will be on guards and certain cuts towards those guards. So unlike Rolworth, where he numbers the cuts, what Jaime does is he'll have an assigned number for each guard, and the cut, an attack towards that guard would classify it as an attack to guard 1. Or so the next episode we're going to talk about, besides guards and cuts, we're going to talk about medio de proporción, or proportion, which is the measure of which, I guess, the fight would start at. We'll talk more about, discuss more about that as well, and other things that will be covered in the chapter. But I think that's a pretty chunky 2 chapters there. So we'll end this here, and thank you very much for watching the first video series on Destreza. I hope you like this video. Feel free to subscribe and join the Destreza Saber Facebook group so that we can work on this together as a study group and figure this all out together. Thank you, and stay safe from the coronavirus.